Welcome to Her Story, the podcast that brings to life the stories of incredible women throughout history. Each episode uncovers the remarkable lives, achievements, and struggles of women who shaped the world, beyond the textbooks and headlines. Join us as we celebrate their legacies and inspire new generations with tales of courage, resilience, and trailblazing spirit. In today's episode, I am absolutely delighted to welcome back Professor Tracy Borman to discuss her brand new novel, The House of Boleyn. Professor Tracy Borman is a best-selling author, historian and broadcaster, specialising in the Tudor period. Her books include Elizabeth's Women, Thomas Cromwell, The Private Lives of the Tudors, and Crown and Sceptre, and many more. Let's get into today's episode. Welcome back to the podcast, Tracy. How are you?
Oh, Jess, it's so lovely to see you and chat to you again. I'm very well, and I am absolutely thrilled just to say from the off that you enjoyed the House of Boleyn, because as you know, your good opinion means a lot to me. You know an awful lot about Anne Boleyn in particular. You've made me some amazing Anne Boleyn memorabilia, so thank you.
Oh, that is honestly, that's made my day already. Thank you. So today we're discussing your new historical fiction, The House of Boleyn, and it's all set from Hever Castle, which was genius. I've got to be honest, it was
Oh,
genius.
great. I'm glad you think so. Yeah, that's right. I mean, I think obviously the story of the Boleyns, it's been told many times, non-fiction and fiction, but it occurred to me it's never been told through the lens of their beloved home, Hever Castle. Um, you know, hopefully, at least some of your listeners will know Hever. If not, I hope it kind of conjures up an image in the book because I spent a lot of time there. It's an absolutely picture postcard castle in the sort of countryside of Kent, southeast England. And it was so beloved of the Boleyns. It wasn't just their power base, it was their refuge. And I think particularly for Anne, once Henry VIII started courting her, she kept escaping to Hever. Who can blame her, actually? And I just thought, what if the entire story of the Boleyns was set there? So even when Thomas or Anne or George or Mary go to court, the action stays at Hever. And it just gives a completely different perspective on this kind of very famous story. So I loved it. It was sort of like the Boleyns meet Downton Abbey, really. It's kind of upstairs, downstairs. As you know, quite a lot of the household servants are featured. So I really wanted to kind of bring to life authentically what it would have been like for Anne and her family living in this beautiful home.
I mean, I did absolutely love that because when I was going through it, I was wondering, like, are we going to miss all of the main events happening at Tower and Hampton Court? But it felt just as real and how it hit Hever Castle, especially Anne's downfall. It's like the household are being ignored completely by everyone else because it's
Yeah.
Anne Boleyn.
Yeah, yeah, I'm really pleased you said that because it was definitely quite a conversation between me and my publisher in that will the reader feel cheated if actually when people go to court the action stays at Hever, and that's why I really built up the subplots, the scheming that went on in the household, and I hope that I created characters who readers could really get behind, who were permanently at Hever. But also, I do have the Boleyns coming back to Hever on a regular basis, so they are definitely front and center, as you know, in the book. So, yeah, it was a delight, and genuinely, I think it gave me a fresh look at the Boleyns, which I didn't think I would say because I do know them quite well.
No, I agree. I think it was also what I loved about it is, and I'm sure the readers, when they once get to read it, will agree that it's interesting not just to see it from Anne's perspective or Thomas, you get to see it from the servants as well. It's
Yes.
kind of nice to see the balance of how it affected everyone at Hever.
Exactly. It's like a kind of ripple effect. If a stone is dropped into a pond, then it goes in ever decreasing circles. There's a huge impact on the whole household, for good and bad, and that was entirely authentic. You just have to look at the fates of some of the most famous victims of Henry VIII and how not just they suffered, but their entire household would suffer at their downfall. And I'm thinking in particular of, I'm afraid, of Anne Boleyn's nemesis, Thomas Cromwell, who had this huge household, hundreds of people working for him. But they all suffered when he fell and they suddenly had to find new jobs, or it was like rats and sinking ships sometimes, but also it could really strongly impact on loved ones as well. And I think, that's why I'm convinced that's why Anne Boleyn made that very complimentary speech on the scaffold, praising Henry VIII, the man who was putting her to death, because she wanted him to be kind to her daughter, Elizabeth. So, yeah, you're right. It has a huge impact on the whole household, what's going on with the Boleyns at court.
What was the research process like for this novel?
So, very early on, when I started writing fiction, so with my Kingswitch trilogy, I was disabused of an assumption that I had that it would be much easier to write fiction because it wouldn't take as much research. And actually, I think if anything, it takes more research than for non-fiction because although, of course, I could draw on all the research I've been accumulating over the years on the kind of historical version of the Boleyn story, what I wanted to really be slavish to was authenticity. I've mentioned that word a couple of times, but to creating a Hever that felt real. And therefore, I did an awful lot of social history research. And I was so lucky to have the support of the wonderful curators at Hever. Owen Emerson, very early on in my research process, took me on a, behind the scenes tour of Hever. We went to every nook and cranny in the castle. So he was able to really share with me what it would have been like in the Boleyn's day. But also, as well as the research on Hever itself, I did a lot on, you know, food and drink, on etiquette, on, just the day-to-day living in a household such as Hever, both for those upstairs and downstairs. And, the fragility of life, not just thanks to Henry VIII, but thanks to sickness and disease and sort of the rudimentary medicines available and just how fragile life was. I really wanted to get that across in the novel. So yeah, I did an awful lot of research. My method is I sort of research and write as I go along. So although it's always very tempting to spend years just immersing yourself in the research, I would never then get around to writing. So I kind of do it at the same time, which kind of works.
How did you decide what you wanted to fictionalize and keep real to the story?
So, as you know, Jess, the Boleyns are much loved.
Hmm.
And I didn't want to mess with the known history too much because it is such a well-known story. And there are many Boleyn devotees and aficionados across the world. And I thought it would be off-putting. I would find it off-putting in a novel if some of the really obvious, well-known events actually were then changed. For me, that would lose credibility. So really, I had the structure of the novel from the known history. The only times I departed from it, perhaps I tweaked the chronology slightly for a couple of things, but what I did in this book and what I do in all my fiction books is to include quite a lengthy author's note at the end to explain to the reader, if I've diverged from the known history, this is why and this is where. And I think historians who write fiction have a responsibility to do that. And I personally, I read historical fiction a lot. I love it. And I always really appreciate the author's note. I find it almost as interesting as the actual novel. So I was determined to include one of those. So where I did really let my imagination run wild was in creating new characters, and entirely fictional characters, such as Anne Boleyn's beloved maidservant, Esther, who didn't exist. In fact, we only have the confirmed name of one member of the Hever household, and that was Robert Cranwell, Thomas Boleyn's steward. There's hints of a Mrs. Orchard who may have been a governess to the Boleyn sisters, Mary and Anne, but it's unsubstantiated. So really, that's when I could let rip, if you like, with the servants. I could make up names, I could make up characters and plot lines, and I really did. So yeah, as a general rule for the readers of this novel, what happens above stairs is pretty historically accurate. What happens below stairs is more my imagination.
I mean, I loved the servants except maybe Cranwell, and that's all I'm going to say about him is that I didn't like him.
He's horrible. He's horrible. And I hope the real Robert Cranwell will forgive me because actually, we don't know a lot about him. He may have been a lovely man, but every novel needs a villain.
Hmm.
I'll leave it there. And Cranwell, yeah, he was a fairly delicious villain to write for me.
I loved in the book Jane Boleyn and how you really humanized her. She wasn't the pantomime villain, but she was a real woman with choices, and I think you really displayed that well in the book.
Oh, thank you so much because she is the one I was most excited about in a way. I think she's been much maligned by history. She's as you say, the pantomime villain. She's always quoted as the one who brought down Anne Boleyn, who brought down her own husband. She was cutthroat. She betrayed them all in order to advance herself. The only evidence for that is that we know she did kind of testify to Cromwell, but so did all of Anne's other ladies. And it's much has been made of the fact that Jane then went on to serve other wives of Henry VIII. So she, unusually, it wasn't career over for Jane when her husband and her sister-in-law were executed. So people have assumed that, well, she has to have profited from it. Therefore, she has to have, given Cromwell the information he needed in order to safeguard her own career. We don't know that. Jane could have been made to come back to court and serve the new Queen Jane Seymour as a punishment, and as a warning to others. Look, if your family betray me, then I'm going to rub your nose in it. And that could have been it as well. We just don't know. There's so little evidence against her. So I really loved exploring the what ifs with Jane. And often the other assumption that's made about Jane and her husband George Boleyn is that it's a loveless marriage and that he was possibly gay. And really, the only evidence for that is that they had no recorded children that we can be sure of. Well, that could be for any number of reasons. They may have had short-lived children. Jane may have had miscarriages. She or George may have been infertile. It didn't necessarily mean a loveless marriage. So all of these assumptions I wanted to challenge and to give Jane much more of a voice and much more agency and I hope credibility than history has served her.
No, I think you absolutely did because I think you're right. It's George and Jane oh, they don't love each other. He's gay. You see it in the HBO Tudors that he's with every man at court.
Yeah,
There's no credibility, but there's also, it could be credible, but they could still love each other. It's kind of, you got to challenge the perspective utterly.
exactly, exactly. And that's when fiction is a real joy because it does give you the freedom to explore the what ifs. Whereas in non-fiction, certainly, you could say that, but readers, I think, would soon get fed up if all you said in your non-fiction, well, it could have been like that, or it could have been like that. Whereas in fiction, you can go there, you can create characters, you can create scenarios that fill the gaps left behind by the historical sources. And I did absolutely love writing Jane. Like, I'm so pleased you picked up on her because I really loved her by the end. I kind of, with all her flaws and vulnerabilities, she felt real to me as the Jane in this novel.
How did you want to portray Henry and Anne's story from the perspective of Hever Castle?
So Henry and Anne's story obviously is much debated. And what we know is a one-sided view of it because we have Henry's love letters to Anne preserved in the Vatican. That's always fascinated me. I think 17 of his love letters survive. So we know how he felt, or at least how he professed to feel. We don't know Anne's side. And that was one of the biggest joys, again, of writing this book because I could give her feelings. I could give her quite strong feelings for or against Henry. And I really wanted to centre a lot of that at Hever. So Henry pursues Anne at Hever, but also it's her safe haven when she wants to escape from all of this. So again, assumptions have been made about Anne Boleyn that she's some kind of grasping, ruthless woman who played Henry like a fiddle in order to get a crown on her head. We don't know if she even wanted to be queen. We certainly don't know if she loved Henry. And so I think it's just as likely, and in fact, the evidence did suggest to me that Anne and her father Thomas were constantly kind of trying to take her out of Henry's way and she keeps coming back to Hever, and I don't think it's a ploy to play hard to get necessarily. I think she's genuinely wanting to get out of his way, and I don't think she wants to go the same way as her sister Mary, who was a mistress of Henry VIII, and Anne had perhaps other hopes for herself. We know that early on in her court career, she may have had a secret betrothal to Henry Percy, which was a very, very good match for her. And it was only thanks to meddling Cardinal Wolsey that she wasn't able to marry Percy. So, yeah, I think Anne's real ambitions were probably not for the crown.
No, I agree. I think Hever was definitely a safe haven. And I don't know how accurate the source is, but I'm sure I've read somewhere that Thomas Boleyn kind of says to Anne in the 1530s, "Are you sure you want to marry him? Like,
Yes,
please
exactly.
don't."
Exactly. Thomas, I was very sure of, did not want this marriage. And yet another kind of misconception because Thomas Boleyn is always seen as that cutthroat father putting his children in the path of the king for his own personal gain. And the opposite appears to me to be true. All of the sources suggest he's trying to get Anne out of Henry's way. He's trying to save her, bring her back to Hever, and so that she can, if not make her own choice, at least marry somebody she's comfortable marrying. And I really don't think he wanted this for Anne because he'd worked for Henry from pretty much the beginning of the reign. He knew how dangerous Henry was. And there's no doubt Thomas loved his children dearly. And in particular, Anne, he seems to have had a soft spot for Anne. And certainly he invested in her education and her upbringing more than the other two. And so the last thing he would want is to put her into danger. And he couldn't have known that Henry was going to make his daughter queen. And I think even if he had known, he'd have been more worried still, because that was no guarantee, as Catherine of Aragon had found to her cost. So, yeah, there is a much more nuanced story to the one that we've been told all these years. And yeah, I loved going there. I loved exploring it. Of course, it's still all up for debate. Who knows the real story? Maybe Anne did truly love Henry. Maybe she did scheme to be queen, but maybe she didn't.
No, I mean, you're right. There's so much unpredictability. We don't know the full story, and we may never will know
No,
Anne's side.
exactly. Unless that little cache of letters that we all hope to find in the attics of Hever or wherever they may be, maybe my place of work at Hampton Court, we'll just find them and they'll tell us the answer. Did Anne really love Henry? I personally think she didn't, but we'll see.
I think another thing that was done really well in the novel was when Henry was at Hever, you showed how unpredictable his mood could be. And I thought this was done so well because you didn't know what his mood was going to be from the minute to the next.
Yes, exactly. And that was entirely based on the kind of historical truth, if you like. It was said that if the king thought his cap knew his counsel, he would toss it into the fire. In other words, this was part of his strategy. He didn't like to be predictable. He liked to keep people on their toes, but also naturally, he was fickle. His mood could turn on a sixpence. You never know if he would kiss you or kill you. And I really wanted to bring that across. So I'm really pleased you thought I did. And yeah, it was like playing with fire. Thomas More, um, he compared dealing with Henry VIII to being like a lion tamer. You know, you have to be aware of the lion's strength and that he might sit down and purr one moment, but then turn on you the next. And so I definitely wanted to bring that across. And I think, you know, it's hard not to imagine screen portrayals when you're writing. And I think, although I absolutely love the Damian Lewis version of Henry VIII in Wolf Hall, actually, Jude Law, when he played Henry VIII, you really got that sense that he could turn, and you just didn't know which way he was going to go. And yeah, that was the kind of the Henry in my imagination as I was writing that. And you're right, you see his best and his worst sides in quick succession at Hever Castle.
Did you have a favourite character to write about in the novel?
So Jane Boleyn was definitely up there. Um, and yeah, I did enjoy writing Cranwell because it's very true, villains are fun to write. Um, but probably one of the biggest and best surprises for me was Margaret Butler, Margaret Boleyn, her married name, Anne's grandmother. So she was an extraordinary woman. I didn't know much about her before writing this novel. I loved getting to know her. She was an Irish noblewoman, and really, it was her marriage to William Boleyn, Thomas's father, that gave the Boleyns this kind of pedigree that they were lacking, this kind of noble edge. Whereas before that, their rise was based mainly on kind of trade, wealth. Um, they'd worked their way up, but the Butlers were this very respected Irish nobility. And Margaret Butler, you know, she comes over to marry this rich kind of Norfolk man, William Boleyn. And she seems to me to have been quite a formidable matriarch and yet ultimately quite a vulnerable one. And I don't want to give too many spoilers, but suffice to say, what happens to Margaret in the novel was absolutely based on the known records. I've given it different layers of interpretation, but the fundamentals of what happened to Margaret were absolutely based on the sources. And she, again, imagining the screen portrayals, she, to me, for those of your listeners who have watched Downton Abbey, was Lady Grantham. And she was Maggie Smith. And that kind of, yeah, that matriarch who's seen it all and is still ruling the roost.
You know what? I did get the vibes when I was reading, like, is this Lady Grant's voice? Where I'm just reading.
Oh, so that came across. That's good. Okay, good. Mission accomplished.
What has been your favourite part about writing this novel?
I absolutely loved immersing myself in the world of the Boleyns. I have written about them a lot, I've researched them a lot, but this felt different to me. It was a joy spending a lot of time at Hever. I loved it anyway. I love it even more now. And just really being steeped in those period details, both by being at Hever, but also then the research into, you know, the world of the Boleyns and what a household was like at this time, and you know how they lived, and everything from how noble girls spent their mornings to what they ate at great feasts to how they decorated their homes. I loved it. And I loved as well being able to fill the gaps that are so frustrating in the sources. So that, as I said, we don't know really what Anne thought of Henry. So that was an absolute delight to be able to make her feel and think what I hope she actually did.
I honestly think this needs to be a TV series because
Oh, Well, Jess, if there are any TV producers out there, I would be delighted. That would be actually a dream come true if this made it to the screen. But it's a story that lends itself to it. It's just so dramatic. That's why the fundamentals of my novel I didn't need to make up. Truth is stranger than fiction.
No, you're completely right. Like the actual, like he kills his wife. What?
Yes, yeah, I know. And it's become deadened over the years, pardon the pun, because that's a huge thing. Executing your wife. And yet, oh yeah, divorce beheaded, died, divorce beheaded. We say the rhyme, and somehow it becomes normal when it absolutely was not. It was unprecedented and shocking.
Towards the end of the podcast, as you know, I like to ask my five fun history questions. So, firstly, have you got a new historical pet peeve?
Oh, now, yes, I've been thinking about this because I thought, what did I say last time? I do have a number of pet peeves. But I think probably, and excuse the barking of my dog Cromwell in the background, but bit of added authenticity. He always tries to make it on the podcast. I think I would say now the pet peeve has to be about Thomas in particular, and also his daughter Anne, always been seen as schemers, as pre-planning the whole thing. Anne's marriage to Henry, it was all part of some elaborate, very ambitious plan for power. And I think there's absolutely no evidence for that. And the total opposite was probably the case.
Start if you want to make a protest this year, I'll be right behind you.
Great. We'll go, we'll do a march. We can do some placards, down with Henry VIII and down with all those who think that Anne and Thomas were just evil schemers.
If you could ask Anne Boleyn one question, what would it be and why?
It would be, what did you think of your daughter Elizabeth? Now, I didn't just say that so that I could mention my book about Anne and Elizabeth, but I would love to know. Certainly I have a very, very strong feeling and basis for believing that Anne adored her daughter. It wasn't just for show that she lavished affection on this little princess. Even though she should have been a boy, but Anne's love for Elizabeth was true and enduring for the brief time that she was able to be in her daughter's life, 2 years and 8 months. And I just think it's so telling that the last thing she did on earth before going to her execution was to order new clothes for her daughter. And but I would, having convinced myself and written the book, I would just like to ask her, if I could be cheeky and ask a supplementary question, it would be, what did you think of your daughter? And are you pleased with how she turned out? I think Elizabeth was Anne's triumph. I mean, goodness me, talk about sweet revenge for Anne against Henry.
Have you got a favourite book that isn't your own?
I do have a favourite book, and it's sort of historical, but it's not necessarily, that isn't really the main focus. It's Miss Garnet's Angel by Sally Vickers. And the reason I love it so much is it's set in Venice, which, when I'm not at Hever, I'd quite like to be in Venice. It evokes that beautiful city so beautifully. It's a really touching story with an unlikely heroine. And honestly, I must have read it, I don't know, 20 times, but I love it. I keep coming back to it. Lovers of Venice. I suspect Sarah Griswold might have read this because she's now just bought a place in Venice. I would highly recommend Miss Garnet's Angel. Comfort reading.
Have you got a favourite historical film?
Favorite historical film? Well, where to begin? Because it would be easier to say TV series, in which case I think Wolf Hall would have to have it. But for films, I'm going to make a quite controversial choice of Elizabeth, the first Elizabeth film with Kate Blanchett. And I say controversial because it does divide the historical community. It did take liberties with the facts, and there are some moments that even make me twitch a little bit. But I just think Kate Blanchett is wonderful as Elizabeth. And what I particularly love is that she captures the vulnerability behind the public image. And not many portrayals of Elizabeth do that. I'm thinking of the most kind of celebrated one with Glenda Jackson in the long-running BBC series Elizabeth R. And Glenda Jackson is absolutely, her portrayal is rooted in, Elizabeth's speeches, in the recorded facts, but it's a bit one-dimensional. Whereas Kate Blanchett, you get that sense of jeopardy and danger and uncertainty, and I just love it. I've watched it an embarrassing number of times, I would say.
No, it is a wonderful film. I can sometimes ignore the inaccuracies if the actual actress or actor gets the character down to a T.
Exactly. I couldn't agree more. And it's a real sort of, it does divide historians because you do get the purists who cannot bear watching any dramatization because it might not be accurate. And then I'm in the other camp that just loves all history on screen. And I think people are intelligent enough to know the difference between fact and fiction, or at least, a film might inspire them to then go and find out what really happened.
And finally, have you got a favourite historical fact?
Yes, I have got a favourite historical fact, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to share it. I'm hoping I haven't shared it before because it relates to Elizabeth again. And it relates to her astrologer, Dr. John Dee, who, as well as being her astrologer, was her spy. And he went abroad on a number of covert missions for the Queen. And he wrote back to her in coded letters. And he had a code name, and that code name for Dr. John Dee was 007. So the original James Bond, perhaps. I just love that.
He's got to have been the inspiration, hasn't he, for the actual James Bond later on?
Yeah, I think so. Ian Fleming must have known of him, or at least have known his code name, because otherwise that's taking coincidence a little bit too far, I think.
Thank you so much for taking the time to discuss your brand new novel.
Oh, Jess, it's been as much of a pleasure as I knew it would be. I apologise to your listeners for my slightly nasal tones. I have caught the cold that is doing the rounds, but nothing would stop me chatting with you today. It really has been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much again for your lovely words about my book, for all the support that you give me and my work. I really do appreciate it.
Thank you for listening to Her Story. If there's a historical woman who inspires you and you'd like to share her story on the podcast, we'd love to hear from you. Get in touch at unholytudor@gmail.com. Until next time, keep celebrating the incredible women who've shaped our world.